Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. How are you? How are you today?
I am great. I am great. We're wonderful fall weather and just sort of settling in. It's been a long sort of season and kind of getting ready for the holiday season. So yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we have Christmas decorations going up already around the city. It's ridiculous, but in a good way, I guess. How about you?
Yeah, I've been super busy actually. My symphony chorus just sang Carmina Burana on Friday, so I've been practicing that for the past couple months, and we finally got that out of the way. It's always fun to sing that with a symphony orchestra. And then I did a half marathon yesterday.
Woo! Yeah, yeah, you got this! Woo! Love you, have a good run!
So I'm feeling pretty fit, very musically strong. And of course, we have this election that we're going to talk about today. Obviously, the US election, no controversy there whatsoever. No issues, seem to have gone pretty smoothly. Be that as it may, we've got results and we've got a lot to talk about that is going to really affect the tech world, both at a high, vague macroeconomic level, as well as some very tactical areas that are going to affect the CIO office and IT organizations all around the country. So there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, I am actually very pleased insofar as I think many of us were bracing for a contested election that was going to be dragged out for days, if not weeks, and that didn't happen, for good or for bad, depending on which side of the aisle you were on. But at least it was resolved. I mean, that was, one of the things that I was very, very concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'll just kind of lay my cards out in line. I was a little surprised by the outcome, particularly with like I said, as strong of an outcome, I guess, as it was. But as it relates to enterprise tech, I think you know, the consensus right now is a couple of things. I think the incoming Trump administration is expected to be, more business friendly, and overall that is at the macro level, like you said, that should be a good thing for tech industry in general. I think the difficult part, as we'll dive into these specific elements around it, I think that the difficult part overall is going to be that while I'm glad that we didn't have a lot of ambiguity around the election itself, I think the Trump administration is going to introduce a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, at least for the short period, for the probably the next 12 to 18 months, because he's very hard to predict. And so it's really difficult, and he's not consistent insofar as you can say, well, this is the lane he's going to go down. And so I think, even with everything we're talking about today, and I mean, I pulled from articles from sort of across the spectrum, and it's like throwing darts. I mean, there's some consistency, we'll talk about some of the things that I think there seems to be a general consensus around impact on tech industry, but for the most part, it's like, who knows? And that's going to be the difficult part if you're a CIO or if you're a tech company leader trying to navigate this is, I think, going to be challenging because we just don't really know which way the winds, so to speak, will be blowing.
Right. And I'm going to lay my cards on the table as well. My personal politics are usually pretty liberal. I've actually worked with state Democratic departments and conventions in the past. Obviously, my personal politics is on one side of the table. That said, Trump is very difficult to read on some of the issues that he does not campaign on a day-to-day basis. And technology is definitely one of those where he honestly did not talk very much about AI or tech. He did talk a little about crypto, which we'll get into a bit later. But I think it's hard to tell what he's going to do at a high level simply because this was not an important area to him. Now, he did have some funders, obviously, like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, who are extremely important in the tech world, Mark Andreessen, people who are literally shaping tech. And I think that will be an important thing to consider, which we'll also get into. And, there are some strengths, some weaknesses, and some really interesting nuances that we're going to get into based on what happened there.
I think I think it's interesting you say that for two reasons. One is it wasn't just Trump. I mean, Kamala Harris' campaign also was pretty silent on most of the impact around the technology industry
Mhm.
and what have you, which I find shocking given how important technology is to the industry, both in terms of
And
its
to
impact on
California.
society, specifically to California, impact on society overall, but impact just from an industry perspective on our contribution
Mhm.
to GDP and all of those different elements. How it was just not a tabletop issue that either campaign was really discussing, and it's doubly interesting in that for maybe the first time we had some pretty significant tech heavyweights weigh in very heavily on this campaign, which again, the tech industry tends to play both sides of the coin, tends to try to be pretty agnostic and not dive into it. And this was an exception this time on in Trump's favor in this case. And that was also interesting. So it's sort of doubly fascinating that there was so little conversation about the tech industry overall in this campaign. But be that
Mhm.
as it may, let's dive into some of the things that you expect. What do you think if you're a CIO or if you're a tech company leader that you would expect this administration to kind of open the door to?
Yeah, I think just from a starting point, it's hard to ignore that the one big tech initiative that we did here in the last 4 years was around Biden's executive order on AI. He did really put his foot down and say that he wanted a variety of aspects, or at least his administration, put down some expected standards for AI safety, security, and governance, which required developers to start talking about sharing their safety test results, providing standards and tools, working with NIST to ensure that the AI systems are working correctly, and figuring out fraud and deception issues. And all of these were directional. Honestly, they never really got to the level of being specific rules, but they were at least directionally relevant to where he wanted AI to be going. And honestly, I think it's pretty obvious that one of the first things Trump is going to do is to erase that, not because he is against these standards, but simply because he has shown a record of trying to erase what the last administration did and put his name and his stamp on what he's doing. That's just his management perspective, and it's what we voted in.
So he's already announced he's going to repeal that. So I think there's that one we can safely say. But I think the big question is, well, then what? And
Mhm.
I think I know that we were talking before we got on air here that you thought, well, he may just replace it with something else. And I think there's certainly going to be a lot of pressure. There was bilateral support for some form of AI regulation. There's a general consensus that we need the government to play a role. However, he also has very vehement vocal support from Elon Musk, which, as we sort of know from his approach to governing, that he rewards that sort of loyalty. And Elon Musk has been pretty adamantly opposed to most of this sort of regulatory action. And so it will be very curious to see which way he lands. I mean, the general consensus from what I'm reading is that this will be a deceleration of AI regulations, and which is not saying much. And so far as to your point, we really don't have any real true regulations for the most
Mhm.
part in place. Um, so I think it's going to be a slower roll, and I think it will be interesting to see how that ultimately plays out. Which to me leads into the other sort of element of it, in that the thing that we've seen out of the FTC over the last 4 years through the Biden administration is a much stronger focus on antitrust actions, mostly targeting tech companies. And those are sort of interrelated because every major tech company, of course, is now tightly woven into the AI fabric. And so that is going to be a question mark, right? There's every indication is that the Trump administration is going to be much less vehement in their pursuit of antitrust actions, and will and if you combine those two together, less or at least slower AI regulation and less antitrust action, particularly affecting tech companies, is that good or is that bad? Honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it could take the handcuffs off a little bit, or it's not. I don't think anyone has handcuffs, but I think everyone right now is kind of doing this, right? They're looking to try to figure out which way the winds are blowing, and if that pressure comes off, then potentially we see an acceleration of innovation where people are moving more quickly but that could also introduce some greater risks depending on where things go. So I think, kind of where I started. I think a lot we don't know, but I think it's those are two fairly safe bets in my mind of the most impactful things we're going to see for tech.
Yeah, it's been no secret that the Federal Trade Commission, with their chairwoman Lena Khan over the past few years, has been antitrust and going after big tech. So, if nothing else, honestly, all of big tech, even big tech on the left, like the Reed Hastings of the world, are honestly kind of glad to see this loosening up of tech standards, because big tech has always been worried about trying to figure out, when are we as Microsoft going to have too much market share, or we as Google going to get too much market share that the Federal Trade Commission is going to start going after us. Obviously, Trump is going to bring in a more trade friendly and commerce friendly set of people across trade and business commissions. That part should
Well,
be
in
safe.
theory,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so let's not forget a huge part of his plank was this. I'll expose my own personal bias. Crazy talk about these ridiculous tariffs, and I'm not opposed to tariffs overall, but he was talking in some cases like 50% tariffs,
Right.
and he has been fairly unclear or unspecific on exactly where those would be applied. But this could have a very negative impact. I mean, obviously from a broad economic perspective, but specific to tech, is if these tariffs are hitting electronics, right? So one of the major issues we have right now around all of this that we're talking about is the ability to build data centers. We've got the power issues, which is also affected by all these sort of regulatory concerns. In that case, probably positively. But could this have a significant impact on cost if the raw cost of all of this equipment that is being imported in, because that's almost all imported, to be built, to be assembled in data centers here in the US, is that going to have a detrimental impact on IT operating costs, because that's going to cause everything to skyrocket? It's a big question mark. And I'll throw one more thing in the loop for you to comment on, is there's also the whole question about the chips bill,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which was this highly touted thing, which I thought the Trump administration was in support of insofar as bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., which is what the chips bill is all about. But I'm pretty sure I read something that he is, talking about repealing that, or pushing for its repeal. And I'm not positive on that one. But so it's like, again, going back to the whole uncertainty of where this all lands. But I think the hardware side of things, with these talks of tariffs, with a potential deprioritization of the chips bill, that could have a very negative impact on a lot of the building that still needs to happen to support all of these AI workloads.
Yeah, so two related areas around domestic capability to support the technology world. I'll start with the chips bill. The part I find interesting about that is that it was designed really to help Intel, but also to help domestic semiconductor and hardware markets in general. But here's the thing: a lot of the spending associated with that bill still has not been done yet. So part of this is we're going to see if there's a race to get all that government money into the U.S. Companies over the next couple of months before the Trump administration comes in, which could be this weird flood of money, because it wasn't supposed to happen this fast, but who knows? But if that doesn't happen, I would expect that Trump pushes the Senate, which is a Republican Senate, and obviously will work smoothly with Trump in a lot of areas. I would expect they would try to push back the CHIPS Act and try to bring that money to be focused in different ways. Obviously, Republicans will want to help out the states and organizations that helped win them the election. This is what both sides do. We tend to give political gifts to the people and the states that ended up helping us the most. Whether we do that directly or indirectly, that has always been a part of the federal government process. So I would expect a little bit of that to be happening on the chip side. Frankly, though, we all know Intel needs the help if Intel is going to remain a world, not even a leader at this point, just a world participant in tech. So I think it's probably in America's best interest, to have a major player in the chip world, but I'm not sure if it's going to really happen, and I'm not sure if NVIDIA is really seen as a fully U.S. company in that regard either.
Well, I mean, it's, we've had this conversation. I think, at the end of the day, tech is a global industry and it
Mhm.
operates globally. There isn't a single organization. For that matter, enterprise organizations all operate globally. So, I've always found this particular argument about US based or whatever sort of a bit of a red herring. But I guess my question is, do you believe then that he is interested in decelerating or repealing the CHIPS Act because it's a Biden thing? Or, I mean, because this one I don't understand. I mean,
Right.
it is focused on the same things that he claims to be for, and so this one stands out for me.
Yeah, I think this is also just a Biden issue. Well, and we saw a bit of this 8 years ago when we used to have this thing called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that was Obama based. So basically, we got rid of it and we replaced it with the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada, whatever, which honestly was a lot of the same thing. And so when Mexico and Canada looked at this thing, they said, okay, this is 90% the same, like 10% in America's advantage. So we'll give you your 10%, and we just want to keep the borders open for free trade. And we just put the Trump stamp on it. And that's gonna be a thing that happens, because at the end of the day, I would think that Trump still wants to be associated with US manufacturing, made in the USA, and American supported technologies. That's a pretty straightforward one. Honestly, that's something that I feel like every politician in the America should be interested in. But especially if you're trying to make America great again, that's America, right? Right? America has to make the
Well,
things that make America rich. Like that. That's just
and I
really
think
straightforward to me.
Well, and I think it's also there's a cybersecurity element of, or a national security element
Yeah.
to it of having domestic chip manufacturing so that you can control the supply chain entirely, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, I agree with you. That's why I find it a little bit perplexing as to why that would be the case.
Yeah.
And I guess I should go ahead.
So I'm honestly not as worried about that side. I do worry more about the tariffs, though. I think you are spot on in pointing out that tariffs often, almost always, get driven back down to the customer. And we've talked mostly about China tariffs in this election, but Pepperidge Farms remembers that in the last term, we also had tariffs against things like South Korean refrigerators. I'm Korean, so I tend to notice these things. Like Samsung and LG, literally like refrigerators, had tariffs on them as well. And things like that will get passed down to the end user. So the bigger issue for tech is if we also see this with, say, Taiwanese based chips, where that is going to directly affect our data center costs and our IT budgets at the end of the day.
And he's made noise about that. Now, I will say, I mean, so I brought up tariffs, and I do think I have a very grave concern of them. I believe they are a blunt instrument in the economic tool set. That said, he also talked about 4 years ago or 8 years ago building a wall, which never happened. And I think that there's at least a chance that these tariffs may end up being more bluster than reality. So we'll see. The flip side of it was the other part of this conversation, though. Again, if we think about the data centers and the impact around it, you have the risk of tariffs driving the cost up. I think on the much more positive side, the other big challenge we're having is power consumption. We've talked about this a lot. And the liberal policies over the last decade or so have been because frankly, Trump didn't actually do a whole lot against this in his first term. Um, have actually been have sort of boxed the industry into a corner where there's so much focus on green energy, so much focus on the regulatory stance that it's actually quite difficult to build power plants today. And that is, and we can have the whole conversation about whether or not we should be, right. Should we not be increasing power consumption? But at least in the short term, there's definitely, it's on the critical path of the ability to support these workloads, to continue the development of this technology. Power is a necessary evil in that. And so it is very clear that his broad stance in this category is pretty clear that that's going to be lessened. He's going to reduce a lot of the focus on green technology. He's going to be much more open regulatorily to have power plants being built and at least in the very short term, that may counteract any impact on the tariffs. So I guess we'll see. The challenge, of course, is that building power plants is a very long-term process. It takes a long time, and will that actually play out? Or by the time they get ready, are the regulations going to change again if there's another shift in the administration? So it's there's a whole lot to it, and it's hard to kind of get your head around it. But again, I find it like sitting here scratching my head. I used to have hair before all this, I guess.
Yes. Biden did make green energy an important part of his legislative push over the past few years. But here's the honest truth. There's a lot that around energy that goes outside of any sort of presidential push, because believe it or not, over the past couple of years, America has become the leading oil producer in the world, passing Saudi Arabia and Russia. And why? Because we have a global economy that pushes for the use of petroleum, whether we like it or not. Obviously, Biden was a more liberal president than Trump was going to be, but Biden ended up pumping more oil in the United States than Trump did. Why? Because honestly, presidents don't end up mattering that much for that specific area of the energy sector. Now, in the tech world, we obviously need more energy. Every reasonable projection says we're probably going to triple our use of energy as IT over the next decade or so because of AI. AI basically being able to use a lot more power and energy, and that power has to come from somewhere. Right? We've talked about the AI nuclear push that is starting to happen. And frankly, I don't think that it's because tech companies wanted nuclear power as much as there just isn't anywhere else to go right now. It's either use existing nuclear power plants or build brand new wind or solar or coal or other power plants. They just did the math and said restarting nuclear power plants or starting little nuclear power plants is probably the cheapest way for us to go over the next 5 to 10 years. They did math. But who knows what Trump is going to say about that? It's unclear what he thinks about nuclear. He's offended by green because it's politically I guess helpful to be against green energy. But honestly, we have a lot of areas in West Texas and Wyoming that are perfect for building up wind farms. So, that's not really based on whether it's good or bad for anybody. It's just kind of this, the feels.
Did you not hear the whole thing about the birds that he went down around? Whatever. Anyway, so I think there's only one other major area that, from a policy standpoint, that I think has a potential to have a significant impact on the tech industry, and that is immigration, specifically in the form of the H1B. During his first administration, he did put on new caps and restrictions around the H1B visa, which a lot of tech companies have used to import talent from around the world. It's interestingly enough, the pandemic actually sort of caused a shift in a lot of that. So it's a little bit questionable the degree to which it would have an impact today if there's a continued tightening. But I do think that's there's some other fun stuff that we'll talk about here in a second, I think. But from a policy standpoint, that was sort of the last one that I have my eye on. And again, I'm not clear. He has not made it. Lots of talk about immigration, not this kind of immigration that he was talking about on the campaign trail. So really unclear if this is in his scopes or his administration's scopes now or not. But I'm curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think this is actually one where tech might have a moderating effect. Like, this might be the first time I've ever said in my life, and I could be wrong about this, that Peter Thiel might have a moderating effect on American politics. But it's hard to see how tech is going to keep teching without H-1B visas at the end of the day. We just don't have enough developers and techies inside the United States to be able to handle all of the work that we do. How do we survive, frankly, without Indian and European developers? Like, I don't know how it would actually work. We would have to take apart a lot of big tech and a lot of IT departments immediately if we really cut down on that set of immigration. So I am hoping in that regard that the tech investors who, won this election are able to make some headway in that regard and point out just the reality of what kinds of visas are needed, or at least selfishly get enough visas for their own companies. So, so that at least there
So
are some available.
So let's talk about Thiel and the others, Musk and Andreessen and a few others that backed Trump very vocally and visibly. I think it's interesting. So clearly they're coming out on the winning end of this. What I'm not as clear on, and what I wasn't clear on during the election, as to why the upside. I mean, with the exception of Musk, I think we can see the upside for Musk. But for the rest of the tech investor community that isn't Musk, I'm curious what you think on that. Is this in fact a win for them? And if so, in what ways? Is it simply authentic that they thought he was going to be better for the tech industry and the tech business, or do you think there's something else at play?
I do think there are some personal reasons that, especially Peter Thiel, Musk, Andreessen, and others have, in terms of their personal politics. I would rather not get into that, to be honest, because I do think there's also some business reasons for them to get involved. For instance, Peter Thiel's ownership with Palantir. Palantir is an obvious government agency, a provider of technology. Likewise, Musk with SpaceX is a big government provider of technology. Mark Andreessen definitely has enough money to be able to invest in large tech organizations that can get government contracts as well. So I think all of them had financial reasons to back Trump in this case and to get a bigger piece of the pie than they are currently getting now. And this especially is true if, say, Musk ends up being able to de facto, say, run NASA. I mean, which might sound wacky on its surface, but SpaceX is already doing so much for NASA, honestly, as a provider, that it would not be a huge surprise for me to see a bigger role there. And then, what ends up happening with all these Starlink satellites and the rockets and stuff. This isn't really IT related, but it just kind of shows why they would have cared about being able to do this. Of course, Musk also has big AI hopes as well. He's been building his gigantic AI data center. He's been trying to get Tesla cars to be self-driving. All these reasons that he is very much locked into America's technology spend, not just from a public perspective, but from a governmental perspective as well. There's a lot of funds that he can dip into for that from a government perspective.
The part that still has me scratching my head, and maybe it's purely personal, like to your point, maybe that's all it is. But the reason the tech industry has largely been agnostic almost since its very existence. I mean, you'd have individual executives go and do whatever, but in terms of, public going out there and sort of representing the company, it is because tech was a sort of universal thing. Every, the country needed it. It didn't matter what administration was in office. It was sort of the same. And so it's just really fascinating to me that there was that shift here. And I'm just not clear, what the outcome. And I think it's particularly impactful because Trump puts so much value in loyalty and sort of rewarding that loyalty, at least he claims to. Are we going to see some kind of favorability for these companies or these portfolios? And if so, does that impact? And I'm sitting here trying to put my CIO hat on and say, is that a good thing? If I'm doing work with a portfolio company that may have that upside, is it a risky thing? Because then that could invite recrimination in the next administration if it's not Trump, or not a Republican administration. So it's just so fascinating to me, and I don't have any great answers. And that also, this one is a little bit more clear. Again, not really all that enterprise IT related, but the whole crypto piece of it was absolutely fascinating to me. The fact that Trump went there so heavily to begin with, especially because from my perspective, crypto sort of gone through its hype cycle and was on the downswing. And now clearly making a huge play and putting a focus on crypto. And so clearly those folks are going to come out I think, on the winning side. Although, again, I'm not 100% sure in which way, unless Trump goes out and actually takes some really big swings about, introducing it as a national digital currency or something.
Yeah, I do want to get into crypto, but just kind of a last note on the investor side that although there were definitely some funders who are going to be big winners, there were also a bunch of tech billionaires who, frankly, either stayed neutral or were Harris supporters. So everything from Netflix, Facebook, but more importantly, probably looking at the major cloud providers, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. They did not really take that much of a stand. You could argue Bezos did a little bit of pushing one way or the other, but Amazon really was not taking a huge stand one sort of way or the other. Satya Nadella did not make a big push. Sundar Pichai did not make a big push in one way or the other. Oracle, Larry Ellison has always been a true red Republican provider, but honestly, his hyperscaler is not large enough to push the scales for a lot of IT groups at this point as the number 4 cloud. So I think when you look at the core,
well, and I don't often defend Larry Ellison, but in fairness, while his personal politics have always been well known, he has always gone to pains to separate them from the sort of company's position on things,
which is a
and
little
so
different from this newest generation. Yes.
very different, and that's what I'm saying. It's very, very different. It's like this whole, and I will say, I really hope it's not a new era. I think that we collectively stand to gain when tech remains pretty neutral.
Mm-hmm.
All right, crypto. What's your thoughts on the whole crypto thing?
Oh gosh, crypto. So all I know is that the market is going to get really weird. I always felt like Bitcoin in particular was a very speculative type of asset, and I saw some potential use for crypto as both a security measure and in providing encrypted and protected communications. But honestly, that never really caught on, I would say, as a full-blown enterprise use case. I think that Bitcoin may help to bring that hype back to some extent, but also we're going to see some really weird, really weird activity with Bitcoin that is just completely unpredictable. But on the flip side, I think this means that from a practical perspective, when we're thinking about payments, Bitcoin is now going to have to be a default piece of the puzzle. Bitcoin enthusiasts would say, "Oh, it already was," but let's be honest. When was the last time anybody paid for a pizza with Bitcoin? There's the first time it ever happened, which was a huge mistake because somebody paid 20 Bitcoin for a pizza, and now that would have been like millions of dollars. But in the real world, people don't currently tend to use Bitcoin as actual currency, and I think this might be its best chance to reach that status. I'm not saying it will, but I think there will be a push to try to get there.
The irony of it is well, so obviously, if you aren't familiar, Trump introduced his own cryptocurrency, his own coin. I forget what he called it, World Coin or something. And so he clearly has a personal interest in crypto finding some success. But the whole reason that Bitcoin or any crypto has not reached that sort of payment status is it's just too volatile. I mean, you to your point, why would I use something for a payment that is going to have that much instability that it could be worth half tomorrow or double the next day, and I just don't know what I'm spending. And so that's why it's never actually really taken on as a currency. So it's interesting. Trump is talking about creating a national Bitcoin stockpile. I have no idea what that would look like. I have no idea why we would do that.
That would be weird. Yes.
Right. He's going out there, and I guess my other part around crypto is it hasn't gone well for anybody, right? It was the mayor of Miami and a few others have gone out there and said, we're going to be the crypto capital. And it has just been a bomb for everybody out
MicroStrategy has
there.
done quite well becoming a Bitcoin company. I've got to admit. They used to be this legacy analytics company, software company. Now they're a Bitcoin stock, and they've gone through the roof.
Oh, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about from a politics standpoint, right? From a politics, any politician has gone out there and tried to put their stake in the ground and say, we're going to be the crypto center of the whatever. It just has never worked. And,
Yeah.
and then we got all the power issues that come with Bitcoin mining. We've got, I mean, that's why we had the whole thing with Ethereum to try to reduce the load. And all. I mean, there's just so many issues with crypto that I find Trump's positioning around it, unless it's purely self-interest based on his coin, I don't understand it. I don't,
Yeah,
it
but
is, this
sometimes
is,
sometimes that's enough. Like, I honestly think a Trump coin is going to be like Trump steaks, or Trump vodka, or some of these things that went nowhere. But I do think he's going to push it, and this is the closest that Bitcoin has ever come to being backed by the US government.
I guess we will see. We will see which way that one plays. Although I will say, I mean, and I guess my bias is going to show through again. I think the difficult part is to have any true backing for it to be real. There's so much infrastructure that has to get built to make that happen,
Yes.
for it to
The,
really happen. And I just don't see anyone having the stomach to actually do that at this point.
yeah, Bitcoin is still so much, honestly, hype and vibes, and good for the people who have made money on Bitcoin as a hype and vibe asset. But yes, there's so much that separates Bitcoin from uh, the US national bank structure and the Treasury and Fort Knox and all of the other things that we have that make the dollar the dollar.
Maybe he's going to go and destroy the Fed and replace it with a Bitcoin stockpile. All right. Anyway,
Mhm.
I will tune it down. The last thing that I had that was again sort of a fun, not horribly enterprise related, but is maybe not fun, but is an interesting thing to figure out which way this is going to go, is the whole content moderation side of things. So he has been a pretty vocal opponent to Section 230, which gave a lot of and I think it's very clear this is a personal thing. He didn't like the fact that there was all this sort of regulation or really protection when he was banned from different social networks back 4 years ago, and so there's clearly some indication he's going to go after this, and that actually, again, I'm not sure how much of a enterprise impact it has unless you happen to be in that space, but I think clearly some very potentially some very significant impacts for social media companies and anyone who right now has this sort of veil of protection from Section 230.
Yeah, and I actually think this is going to be a bigger issue than it originally looks like, because it's obvious to look at Section 230, which provides online platforms with protection against civil liability if their community says something. That obviously applies to Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and Tumblr and all these other social media platforms that are obviously that need to put in more governance. So regardless of whether you're talking about governance for, say, anti-gay slurs or against DEI, one way or the other, that being able to govern that takes a lot more work than what the social media platforms are doing right now. And so they're going to have to actually probably either hire more people or have stricter algorithms that are going to ban more posts automatically to be able to stay with that. But also, pretty much any company that has its own online community is subject to this. Now, the government might not end up going after you, but it's no secret that we've been trying to turn our customers into community and to work with each other, provide self-help or community-based help. And now you're responsible for how they share that content. Of course, a lot of that is professional content that shouldn't go off the rails. But now you have to actually make sure it doesn't go off the rails. And frankly, we're in tech. There's some weird people out there who are developers who have their own very specific perspectives on things, and you have to make sure none of them end up being offensive in the direction that the government says. And each side of the government, both the left and the right, have their own ideas of what is not acceptable.
Well, that was all I had as far as the impact. I'm sure it'll be much deeper and longer than we imagined, but anything
Yeah.
else that you feel is on radar that you think that we should talk about?
So I'm gonna go a little dark here, but I think that the deportation talk that has been going on may actually have an IT issue that is associated with it. So, on the trail, there were on the campaign trail, there was talks of we're going to deport 10 million people, we're going to deport 20 million people, and honestly, I just don't see this administration being organized to enough to be able to figure out all of the aspects that go into that. But I do think that in the process, if they look at this issue at all, if they even get a million, if they get 100,000 to do this, they're going to have to do a variety of things. They're going to have to check workplaces for people. They're going to have to do some sort of facial recognition or tracking from a camera perspective, perhaps some sort of ID tracking process. And I think some of this is going to filter down into the tech world, just from a discussion perspective, if nothing else. So again, I'm going to this dark Big Brother type place, but I just don't see how you can pursue a deportation policy without getting deeper into some of these Big Brother-ish ID issues.
Yeah, so I put this one in the same category as I do the wall and tariffs. I think this one is probably going to end up with more bluster than reality because of the logistics, that how difficult it would be to pull
Mhm.
something like that off. It takes an immense amount of organization. But let's just say, sake of argument right now, that he does attempt to go down that road. I hadn't actually thought about this, but as you were talking about all of it, it occurs to me that there could be this really interesting dynamic because if he were to be able to effectively do this, the only way would be through tremendous use of technology to
Mhm.
do it. And that technology is going to come from these tech companies that are impacted by some of this stuff, which there is definitely a history within some of them, like Google and others, where workers revolt over the technology being used for nefarious means. And so, that if it goes down that road, it could be a really interesting dynamic that could create a lot of turmoil in the tech space, because there's no way to do it without tech. I mean, that's the only way you could possibly pull it off. And so, yeah, that will be an interesting element. But again, I don't actually think it's going to happen. Guess we'll
I
see.
don't think it's going to happen at the millions level. I think there could be some, at least, decorative approach to doing this to please some people. And honestly, some of the advocates for kind of that, hard push are going to be in this administration. But I do think that there will end up being more of a discussion about some of these technologies, especially like facial recognition. And part of the challenge with undocumented immigrants, by definition, is that they are undocumented. So how do you track people who literally don't have documents? Like that is going to be part of the discussion and hype that comes up as we go through this issue. And I can't see how it won't at least get brought up as a political cudgel, if not as an actual policy practice.
No doubt, no doubt. I think it's going to be a very interesting 12 to 18 months as the dust settles on this and we see which way this really goes. There's obviously a lot of hype on the left about how horrible this would be, this outcome. We'll see. I tend to be in the camp, as you and I both know from our time in and around politics, that
Mhm.
presidents have a lot less power than people tend to give them or think they do. Um, and so we'll see. We'll see exactly how much this plays out. But I realize that we typically try to end on something fun and light, and I just don't have it. I don't know what we can end on that is a nice light topic to say, hey, here's what's you
Well, we
know.
didn't take on a light topic to start with, but I will say that I can't promise lightness, but I will say that the big term, I think, as you said at the beginning of this, is uncertainty. We are making a lot of guesses right now, best guesses, as well as some practical topics that might end up coming up for you as an IT worker. But at the end of the day, a lot of this can change quickly, and we saw that. We had this president already for 4 years, and we saw how he could change his mind from day to day. Um, just thinking about things like in California, we had these gigantic fires in 2020. We would hear on one day, no, you're getting no federal funding because I'm going to be really tough. And the next day, oh, yeah, by the way, I also called a state of emergency. So you're going to get all your federal funds. And it was a lot of this going back and forth. And I expect if you can talk about that for something like fires, like IT is not as important as forest fires, burning down houses. So, all I know is we're gonna be on pins and needles for some of the topics that directly affect our jobs. And honestly, there's not going to be a great way to figure out to predict what is going to happen on a daily basis.
Yep, and I guess that maybe the way I'll end this is that, on November 6th, I got up in the morning, and like every morning, I took my daughter and my dog out for their morning constitutional. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, people were walking by, cars were going, buses were running, and the world continued. So, I think that particularly in the US, and certainly I would say in the Western world, the vast majority of everything that affects our day-to-day life has nothing to do with our governments. It has to do, except in the very, very macro form of, hey, we got this space that we can operate in, and we operate with a degree of freedom. We can do what we want, to go and live our lives, and that continues. And with any luck, it will continue to continue, and we'll all just see where this plays out.
Yes, I do think it's really important at the end of the day that we find ways to communicate with each other. Obviously, we are a politically divided country, and I am not saying that you should compromise your ideals and compromise your perspectives and compromise your morals, but we have to find ways to talk to each other, talk beyond our conflicts. And this isn't just in America. We have to talk with our colleagues in India or in Nigeria or in Korea or in any other country in the world with their own set of beliefs, and find ways to be able to talk to each other together in ways that make sense. And often we have similar goals. We have very different ways of pursuing those goals. And it's important to know that at the end of the day, we are where we can work together and find those areas of both compromise and cooperation. And I'm hoping that we can figure out how to do that over the next 4 years. I think that will be really important for us. Yeah, so we should keep fighting for the personal ideals that we care about, but professionally and culturally and socially, we still need to be able to work together on the things that are most important to us.
And on that note,
all right. On that note, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always, and we'll do the same thing next week. Everybody, thanks for joining us on This Week in Enterprise Tech. Please like, please subscribe, and please let us know what you want us to take on next. Thanks.